Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Sandwich Public Library. My name is Matthew Jones, and I serve as the Adult Services Coordinator here at the library. Tonight, we have a huge honor, a privilege, and that is to hear from Agnes Schwartz, who is going to tell her story, her experience as a Holocaust survivor. I want to start by saying thank you to Agnes, thank you to the Illinois Holocaust Museum who helped to arrange this and connect us. What a privilege. I mentioned to Agnes before we began the live stream here that I feel like getting to host her tonight is one of the great privileges of my life up to this point. And I know that you all feel the same about being able to hear her directly from her and to be able to ask some questions. Let me begin by giving a few instructions. We have folks that are viewing here in the library. Thank you for coming. Welcome. If you're viewing from the library, there's a few special instructions for you. And if you're viewing online, there are also some instructions for you. So there's kind of two elements to how you can participate tonight. And first, I want to tell you how you can participate in the Q&A at the end of Agnes's presentation. If you're online, you'll see on Zoom at the bottom of your screen a box where you can chat or a box where you can put a Q&A. You're welcome to put your questions in either of those. I'll be keeping an eye on both, and we'll see those. We'll get through as many as we can. If you're here in person and want to participate in the Q&A, there are some blue slips of paper on the table, and you can write your questions on there and leave them in that bucket, and we'll collect those up just as Agnes is finishing, and then we'll get through as many of those as we can as well. The other way you can participate tonight is that we have some giveaways we'd like to give away. And so we're going to give away a copy of Agnes's book to one person who attends online and one who attends in person. So if you're viewing online, if you could put in the chat the name of everyone who's watching with you, I'll take down all those names and then we'll draw from those. And those of you who are in person, there are some white slips of paper. You can put your name and phone number on there, and then you can leave those in that white basket and we'll draw from there. We're also going to be giving away to one participant from online or in person 2 tickets to the Illinois Holocaust Museum. So we'll do that drawing as well tonight. And so someone will get to visit the museum themselves and to experience that. So those are all the instructions that I have. Hopefully you're finding the chat box okay, the Q&A box all right. And so once again, I want to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum for arranging this. And then I have to say a huge thank you to you, Agnes, for sharing your evening with us, for telling your story, and for letting us ask questions. So thank you for being here. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Matthew. And I thank you for inviting me to your library and for your audience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess I'm going to turn it over to you. I look forward to hearing your story.
Okay. Well, I was born way back in 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. It was my lucky year to come into the world. I was born to parents who had been married 8 years in Budapest, Hungary. And they wanted a child very badly. And the story went that when the doctor delivered me, my father was so happy to get a little girl, he gave the doctor an extra $100. I don't know if that's a true story, but this is what I was told when I was a child. And of course, I love to hear that story. Nobody could have had a better early childhood than I did. My parents were relatively affluent. They owned a business whereby they sold yard goods and the accessories to tailors who made custom-made suits, mostly for men. My mother worked in the store with my father. And because of that, we had a live-in housekeeper. Her name was Julia. And Julia just became another member of the family. She cooked some delicious meals. She cleaned the house. She took care of me. She took me to the park. She played with me. And she was just another mommy to me. My mother had a family in Europe. She had parents who lived in a small town called Rákosliget, maybe an hour's train ride from Budapest. And grandma's raised chickens and geese and ducks. And the aroma from the fruit trees were absolutely delicious. And the back fence was lined with raspberry bushes. And she grew vegetables and flowers. And I loved to spend time with grandma and grandpa in Rákosliget. I was my parents' only child, and I was my grandparents' only grandchild in Europe. My mother had two sisters who had immigrated to the United States long before I was born, and I only knew of them from the stories my parents told me. Now, as I said, my early childhood was super good, and my parents took me on vacations at beautiful Lake Balaton in the summertime, and we vacationed in the ski chalets on the Kékes Mountains in the wintertime. And I'm telling you all this not to brag about it, but you see how drastically my life changed after the Germans occupied Hungary. Now, perhaps you remember from your history classes that Hungary was occupied very late in the war, way after Poland and Czechoslovakia and many of the other Eastern European countries were under German regime. I was enrolled in grammar school, and I knew nothing about the war. I mean, I heard there was a war going on, but I had no idea who was fighting who, and I didn't even know what anti-Semitism was at the time. My parents did their best to shield me from any bad news, don't scare the child. And they listened to the news and the radio, but never when I was within earshot. And even before I started going to school, my mother started to impress on me the importance of doing well in school, because there was a law in effect already called numerus clausus, whereby only 1% of a college class could be made up of Jews. Now, my mother's older sister who immigrated to the United States, her name was Ethel. Ethel became a physician in Hungary, and she also married a physician. How she became a physician in Hungary in those days, I really don't know, because it was hard enough to get into medical school as a woman, let alone a Jewish woman. So my mother wanted very much for me to walk in Ethel's footsteps. And they enrolled me in a Catholic school. And I've asked myself many times why a Catholic school, and I can come up with two possible answers. One, that it was the best education in the area, or the other, or perhaps both, that it was safer to send a Jewish child to a Catholic school. I felt absolutely no anti-Semitism at school. Every morning we studied the New Testament, and I became well-versed in it. And there was a teacher who came in to teach the Jewish children our religion a couple times a week. Obviously, there was no separation of church and state as we know it in the United States. I felt no anti-Semitism in school. We were all treated equally. But after school, I had my little Jewish friends, and the Catholic kids had their friends, and never did we mix after school. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm sorry, I couldn't stop.
Call from Cheryl. Call from Cheryl.
Can't find my phone now. Okay, let's just continue. I'm sorry. I am on a Zoom. I'll talk to you tomorrow, okay? I'm sorry, I don't know how to turn this off. Okay, so now I was going to school and I was telling you that I felt no anti-Semitism at school. However, I went home one day and I said to my parents, there's a strange looking flag on one of these buildings. And I knew what the Hungarian flag looked like, but this was not the Hungarian flag. And they looked at each other and they said, well, that's a building of the Arrow Cross. That was the Hungarian Nazi Party. And of course, that was a swastika on the flag. And that was really my first acquaintance with the swastika. So after the Hungarian school system is set up so that you go to school for 4 years and then you graduate. And then it depends on your grades, whether you can go on to a gymnasium, which is an 8-year college preparatory school, which was the aim of my mother. Or if your grades weren't good enough, then you went to a polgari where you learned a trade. It was 4 years, so you could go out and make a living. And I remember tears of joy in my mother's face when we went to read a list that was posted on the school's door, and it showed who made it into the gymnasium. And yes, I made it into the Jewish gymnasium. And now I went on with my little Jewish friends, many of them, and not all of them, to the Jewish gymnasium. By the time I graduated grammar school, the Allies were bombing, mostly in the dark of night. And the alarms would go off, the sirens would go off, and we would grab some warm clothes and head for the basement. I lived at that time in a 3-story apartment building, and we lived on the 3rd floor, and everybody cuddled together in the basement, and the building shook and trembled, but I don't think that building was ever directly hit. And people looked so scared, and as a 10-year-old, I really couldn't understand why they were so scared. Nothing is going to happen to us. That's a 10-year-old's mind. And then eventually the all clear signal went off, and we went upstairs and went back to bed and went to sleep. Now, this happened so often that it became such a routine that after going back to sleep, I got up in the morning, I got dressed, and I went off to school, and my parents went off to work. And life went on like that until March 1944, when the war was almost over and the Germans, as a last-ditch effort, and they knew they were losing the war, suddenly occupied Hungary. Hitler sent his henchman, Adolf Eichmann, to finish the final solution, which was ridding Hungary of Jews. He's done pretty well with all the other countries. And this is when my life changed drastically. The first thing I can remember and tell you that is having to wear a yellow star, 10 centimeters in diameter, sewed on sufficiently that a pencil could not be slipped between the stitches. So should the occasion rise, you couldn't just grab it and tear it off. And then my parents must have heard of some atrocities in the outlying areas. And they moved my grandparents in with us because they imagined that nothing like that could happen in the big city. Okay. So we were a little more crowded, but life was still okay. Of course, I had to stop going to school. And my father lost his business. And oftentimes somebody went to a grocery store and never to be heard of again. As a matter of fact, in a matter of 60 days, all the Jews, except the Budapest Jews, had been deported, mostly to Auschwitz, but from all the outlying areas. And my parents must have known something about that in order to move Grandma and Grandpa in with us. So we lived like this until June, and then a new law, anti-Jewish law, came down that all the Jews had to be moved into what they called a yellow star or a Jewish designated building, both meaning the same. There was a big yellow star painted on the front door, and only Jews lived in those buildings. And it was only a couple blocks away from where we had lived. So we moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. An older lady and her daughter lived in 1 bedroom, and my mother, father, grandma, grandpa, and I lived in the 2nd bedroom. And we could only take what we could carry, so that wasn't very much. I remember going to sleep for the first time in the new apartment and waking up in the morning with terrible red welts all over me. And I was itching and scratching, and what is this? And I was allergic in the summertime to strawberries and all kinds of milk products, so I thought it was the hives like I used to get during the summer. Well, this wasn't that. The place was infested with bed bugs. And every night we went to sleep, in the morning we woke up all bitten up. By law, the bathtubs had to be always filled with water in case of a bombing, I imagine. So there would be water available. And when I would get up in the morning, during the night, these 2 ladies in the other room would go and shake their nighties into the tub. And I would get up to a blanket of floating bed bugs, and it was not a very appetizing sight. But this is the way it was, and there was nothing we could do about it. Now, people were running out of food. Even if you had the money, and many people didn't have any money because they were unemployed already for several months. But even if you had the money, you were only allowed to go to the grocery store after 4 o'clock. And by that time, the shelves were pretty empty. My mom was always a business lady. I don't ever remember her cooking. But Grandma was there, and she was a good cook, and she made do with whatever she could find. I can't tell you I ever went hungry, but I think that was perhaps because the adults gave me a portion of their dinners also. My grandfather was not well when we moved in there. I did not know what was wrong with him. But as time went on, he got worse and worse, and he got so sick that we could not keep him at home. And we all went and took him to a so-called hospital. And I'm calling it a so-called hospital because if you remember the television program MASH, or if you've seen some old-time movies with some old war pictures where the cots were lined up one next to the other, that's the way I remember leaving Grandpa. And to this day, I don't know if Grandpa died of natural causes, or they starved him to death, or they killed him. They outright killed him. None of us ever found out afterwards. But Grandpa was gone. And we all went back to the apartment because there was a curfew and we had to be home before the curfew was over. So now Grandpa was gone, and then one day a troop of Nazis marched into the building, and the gunshot rang out into the air. And of course, we all jumped to attention. What do they want? And they ordered all men, working age men, probably 18 through 45, something like that, but it included my father, to line up downstairs. Everybody always had a little backpack ready to go because that was the order. And my father, well, he had a beautiful custom-made coat by the tailors who were his customers. And the Budapest winters are like Midwestern winters in here. So they're cold. So he put on his heavy coat and his boots and his little backpack. And we were told, and the Nazis told many, many lies. But this is the one that stands out in my mind and is apropos to the situation. They told us who were left behind that they're taking these people to work and they will be back. Of course, they had no intentions of bringing them back. But now my daddy was gone. And a few days go by and the same scenario takes place, except this time they ordered the women. And there stood my mother in front of me in her beautiful gray Persian lamb coat and her boots and her little backpack. And she looked at me and she said, "Be a good girl and listen to grandma, and I'll see you soon." I was 11 years old, and that soon never came because that's the last time I ever saw my mommy. She was gone. But I still had grandma, and ladies and gentlemen, I was very lucky because I was always with somebody I knew would take care of me. I was never totally left alone. And the kids who were alone were all rounded up, and the Germans had no use for Jewish children, and they were sent very quickly to the gas chambers. So I still have grandma. And one day there's a knock at the door, and of course we all jump because it's probably the Nazis, and what do they want this time? And to our surprise, it was my father. And he came in and told us a story that he was in a cattle car, not knowing where they were going. And if any of you ever visit the Illinois Holocaust, there's a cattle car that like the Germans used, built right into the museum, so you can see it. And a couple of German officers needed directions to Budapest. And that was his lucky day because he spoke a fluent German. And so he became their guide. And when they got back to Budapest, they let him go. So he walks in, and the first thing he looks around and says, "Where's mommy?" And grandma and I tell him how she was taken away. And immediately my dad said, "I'm going to go after her. I know where they're collecting the people. They're collecting them at the brickyard." Well, it turns out that they virtually always collected the people at the brickyard because brickyards were situated on the railroad, and that facilitated the deportations. And I, as a little girl, cried and said, "Daddy, please don't go. Mommy's gone. Don't leave me. Stay with me." And even my mother's mother, my grandmother, said to him, "There's nothing you can do for her. So there's no point in you going after her." And grandma was right. There was nothing he could have done for her. So my daddy stayed. And then once again, there's a knock at the door, and who could this be? And it was Julia, our housekeeper, my second mother. And Julia came to take me home and hide me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, to hide a Jewish child is a capital sin. And she risked her life in order to save mine. And without Julia, I would not be here telling you my story today. We took off my yellow star, and grandma put a few articles of clothing in a brown paper bag. And Julia and I walked out of her building and got onto a streetcar to go to her house. And on the way to her house, she told me that we're going to tell the neighbors that my parents live in Eastern Hungary, where the Russians were occupying the country already. And they wanted to get me away from the Russian occupation. So they sent me to the big city to my aunt. And she told me that I had to be very careful because she had a neighbor who was a big Nazi sympathizer. And should she find out that Julia was harboring a Jewish child, that would be the end of both of us. So here I am, 11 years old, and I know that I cannot cry out and say I want to go home to mommy and daddy, or I can't even laugh out loud because I can't draw any attention to myself. Now, Julia had potatoes and beans and some smoked meats in her pantry. So once again, I was among the lucky ones who had enough to eat. Maybe not what I wanted to eat, but I had enough. There was always something. I could even remember Julia baking bread at the beginning. And then one day, the skies opened up and bombs started raining from the skies. And I mean nonstop raining bombs. And this is the 5-story apartment building. And everybody heads for the basement. And we take blankets and pillows with us. And there's a stack of chopped wood in the basement, probably for firewood. And we make beds for ourselves next to each other on this stack of wood. Ladies and gentlemen, that was a horrible, horrible place to be. First of all, there was no electricity. We lived by candlelight. This was not meant to be lived in. It was dark, it was cold, it was damp, it was dank. Every bad adjective I could think of, I could throw at it. But the worst part was there were no toilet facilities, and you have 5 stories full of apartments and all these people, and there's a bucket passed around, and you did your business in the bucket, and it's thrown out in the dark of night, and the place becomes very stinky in a very short time. And there are no choices. Either you go out and get bombed out, or you stay and you smell the place, and you live like that. And we lived like that, huddling together until the middle of January for about 2 months. And in between bombings, every once in a while, Julia would run upstairs and grab some food and bring it down. And the building rocked and shook many times. And finally, around the middle of January 1945, word started spreading from building to building that there was guerrilla warfare in the streets, and the Russians were occupying Budapest, thereby freeing the Jews. Hip, hip, hooray. Well, we waited a while. Nobody dared to move or open a door, and slowly the bombing stopped, and even the machine gun fire abated. And finally, we had the nerve to open the basement door and see what's going on the outside. So, can you imagine being in a dark basement for 2 months, and now it's January and there's snow on the ground, and the sun is reflecting off the snow, so it makes it very bright outside. So they opened the door, and I couldn't see a thing, but I could smell. And the only way I can explain that smell, that it was simply the smell of death. There were dead bodies all over the streets. There were dead horses all over the streets. People were so hungry, they were running out with carving knives to carve up the horses for a meal. But The war was over and we were alive. We were alive. It was unthinkable in the last couple of weeks in that basement. The question really became what's going to kill us first, the Nazis or the bombs? And now it was all over and we could go up to the apartment. One of the staircases was bombed out and the other staircase was intact, so we were able to go upstairs. My head was full of lice, so was everybody else in that basement, I'm sure. And Julia worked on it with a fine tooth comb and I think some kerosene. And anyhow, that was the least of our problems after the life and death situation we had just survived. Now, today you all have a cell phone in your pocket or in your purse. Well, imagine a world without telephones. Can you even think about that? That's unimaginable today. But that's the way it was. Most homes didn't even have a home phone, and that was Julia's case. And even if people had a home phone, well, the wires were all down from the bombings. So there was absolutely no way of communication. Who lived or died, we did not know. I slept in a comfortable bed with Julia's arms around me, and she made me feel very safe. And I was playing out in front of her apartment one day, and as I looked up, there was my daddy walking up the steps, and I flew into his arms. Now, my father by nature was a very handsome man. He was very tall and slim and walked very erectly. And now he was hunched over and his complexion was a strange color. Obviously, he wasn't well, but I was so happy to see him. And he came in and slowly his story unfolded how he survived. And he survived in one of the Swedish protected buildings. Now, there was a Swedish diplomat by the name of Raoul Wallenberg. And he was instructed to buy up as many apartment buildings in Budapest as he could. And I don't know if he bought a pass to move in there. It was, some were forged, some were real. I have no idea how much these passes cost or anything about that. All I know is that he survived in one of these Swedish protected homes. And the Nazis were told that these, the people in these buildings are under Swedish protection. And if they survive the war, Sweden will take them after the war. Sometimes the Nazis listened, and in some instances they didn't. They took the Jews away anyhow. But this is how my dad survived. And to quote him, there wasn't even enough room to stretch a leg. And of course, food was very, very scarce. So it was obvious that he wasn't well and he needed rest and some good food. And passenger trains were not running yet. And he and I got on a freight train, much like the one that he was being deported in. And when we got to a small town or village, we got off. And he knocked on a farmer's door and negotiated with a farmer and his wife. I have no idea what was said, but they took us in and they gave us a room, a couple of comfortable beds. And that lady, oh, that lady cooked the most delicious bowl of scrambled eggs that night. I hadn't as much as seen an egg for at least the past couple of years. So there's good food on a farm, and rest and relaxation. And the village or the town had a little soccer team, soccer being Hungary's national sport. And my dad loved to watch the soccer, and I loved being with him. So that's how we spent our afternoons at the soccer games. And we must have been there for 2 or 3 weeks. Now, I guarantee you that these farmers did not take us in for free. My father must have had some money, and the only way I can imagine he had some money is that if he gave Julia some money before the war to hide it for him. And this is strictly my imagination that I'm talking from, because I can't see it any other way. You know, when the Germans marched into Hungary, all the people in the outlying areas opened their arms because they were offered better living conditions, and Hungary was undergoing a depression at the time, and people were out of work, and they were promised better living quarters and better jobs, and so most people, except for the Jews, welcomed them. So anyhow, though my father felt a little better, we went back to our original home, and we found the family living in our apartment. These were decent people. Most people were robbed of all their belongings they left behind. These people left everything intact where we left them. And for a brief time, we even shared our apartment with them until they could find some place to move to. And by this time, there were trainloads and trainloads of deportees returning. And every trainload, I looked for my mother, and she didn't come, And we didn't know what happened to the rest of the family. But normalcy came about slowly but surely, and my father got his business back, and I started back at the Jewish gymnasium and met up with some of my little friends. We were all so traumatized about what had happened that none of us asked each other, how did you survive? Are your mom and dad home? Did they survive? It was a deep, dark secret that none of us dared to talk about. I think back, and to me today, it would be so natural. The first thing I would say to my friend is, how did you stay alive? None of us asked each other. Life just went on. And one day my father came home from work and told me that a couple days after Julia had taken me, all the Jews left in the Yellow Star buildings were herded into the Budapest ghetto, where they were even more crowded. This included my grandmother and my uncle and aunt. And now the war is practically over. It's a matter of days before all of Hungary is occupied. But for the Hungarian Nazi Party, this wasn't fast enough. And people were dropping dead in the ghetto like flies because of the lack of sanitation and the lack of food. But that wasn't fast enough. They were adamant to kill as many Jews as possible before their day was over. So they would come at night and round up a group of 8 or 10 people and march them down to the shores of the Danube. And then wire them together, and they were running low on ammunition, so this worked out fine for them, because then with one bullet, they could send them all to the bottom of the icy Danube. So please don't talk to me about the blue Danube, because the blue Danube is very red from all the Jewish blood that has been shot into it. And that was the fate of my darling grandmother and uncle and aunt, who were law-abiding, decent people. Hungarian Jews were always Hungarian first and then Jewish. And their only sin was having been born Jewish or having had some Jewish blood in them. So now we know what happened with that part of the family. Now I'm going to go back a little bit, because for years, the American family, my 2 aunts in America, had urged my parents to immigrate also. And my father's mantra was always, Jews have never had it so good in Budapest. I have a well-going business, and the rest of the family's here, and we don't want to go anywhere. And around 1942, I think my parents woke up to the realities, and our immigration process started. And we got so far that we had all our ducks in a row, and huge wicker baskets packed up with our belongings had been shipped out already, and they were in Lisbon already, when in the last minute the Germans wouldn't give us the visa to go through their country. Had we been able to immigrate at that time, my life would have gone very, very differently. So we got our belongings back at that time, and this is how my family and I got caught up in the Holocaust. So now let's go back to not the present time, but to 1946, 1947, 1946. I go back to school again, and my father comes home one day and he has tears in his eyes, and he tells me that a lady came into the store who was at the Bergen Belsen concentration camp. You probably have heard of it if you know Anne Frank's story. Anne Frank died there also. And she knew the exact date, and I have verification of that, so I don't know how she could keep track of the date in a place like that. But my mother died in her arms on Friday, January the 13th, 1945, of so-called natural causes, which probably meant typhus and starvation. So now there was nobody left to wait for. We knew nobody else was coming back. And our immigration process started all over again. And in January 1947, my father and I took a train to Berlin. Julia met us and saw us off at the train station and gave me a beautiful little ring just as a memento. And of course, I thanked her for saving my life, but I wasn't really old enough to appreciate it at that time. And we slept, my dad and I slept at a bombed out hotel in Berlin, but every building in Budapest was also bombed out, so that was okay. And next day we got on a propeller Pan Am plane and started out for the United States. Well, this was a long trip over the Atlantic, and my father tried to keep me busy by telling me stories about Native American families. Between my two aunts, I had three cousins. My mother's younger sister, Betsy, and her husband, Eugene, had two boys, and Etta and her husband, George, had one son. And oh, my father told me that everybody was rich in America and what a wonderful life we're going to have. The streets were paved with milk and honey. And above all, since all my cousins are boys, I would be the princess. Well, that sounded good, pretty good to a 13-year-old little girl who had just lost everybody she has known from her childhood on. Everybody she loved. So we encountered a storm over the Atlantic, and we had to make a stop at Newfoundland, an emergency stop. And they put us up, the men and the women, in separate barracks. I wouldn't leave my father's side, and I stayed with him. And next day, they ushered us into a beautiful white tablecloth dining room. I have no idea what they fed us. All I can tell you is that I saw ice cubes in glasses for the first time in my life. I never saw an ice cube. The Iceman brought the ice in big chunks in Hungary. Look at that, Daddy. There are ice cubes in the glasses. Oh, wow. And the storm died down, and we flew into New York, and my Uncle Eugene came and met us there. And then we took a train to Chicago. And my Aunt Betsy and her family lived in West Rogers Park in Chicago. And I met my two cousins. I had taken some English classes in Hungary, but the spoken English and what I had learned in school were like night and day and night. I couldn't understand the word they said. Then my other uncle and aunt, the physicians, came over to meet us, and they heard my father coughing. Right away, they sent him for a chest X-ray. Well, my daddy had tuberculosis, had to be separated from the family, and off to Winfield Sanitarium he went. And I was left alone with a strange family, with a strange language and strange customs. And I was totally lost in this wonderful American world. So this family took me every single Sunday so I could wave to my father through the windows, because they wouldn't let children in. My aunt enrolled me in grammar school. I should have been in the 8th grade, but because of the language problem, they put me in the 3rd grade. Little kids are wonderful teachers. They speak a simple English, and each and every one of them was so eager to teach me a word or two. I was a novelty at school. I understand that some kids were picked on who came from Europe. I can't say that was true for me. They all loved me and gathered around me, and I was promoted into higher and higher grades until I got to the 8th grade. And by the time I knew enough English that I could graduate grammar school and go on to high school. I even made a little speech on the podium. Just about the same time, finally, my father's was pronounced negative. That meant he was no longer contagious and he could come home. And now my heart leaped with joy. My daddy's coming home to me, and I can go live with him and be happy again. And that didn't happen either, because my daddy said that he couldn't assimilate, he couldn't adjust, couldn't learn the language. He wants to go back to Europe. It was a terrible, terrible blow to me, because I had already lost my mother and everybody else. And I said to him, Daddy, it's only you and I. There's nobody else left there. And don't do this to me. Well, my Uncle Eugene, God bless him, and I didn't appreciate it at the time, but as I grew up, I certainly learned to appreciate it. He said to my father, if you insist on going back, I'll pay your way, but I'm not going to pay for you to take the child back. If you want to pay her fare back whenever you can, but anyhow, that never happened. That's the last time I ever saw my father. I was 14 years old. And I resented it bitterly that he left me. And today I thank my Uncle Eugene that he had the foresight to keep me here and undertook raising me, because there's no place like the United States. And I am so happy that my children were all born here, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. So I had a hole in my heart. I imagined all kinds of things. There was no such thing as a therapist at that time. Today, there's a tragedy at a school or someplace, and therapists help the kids and the grown-ups through a terrible situation. At home, nobody wanted to hear of what happened to me. And I was told not to talk about it. And I was also taught, well, the family I came to was not very religious. And so I became very not religious also. I took on the thought that being a Jewish was not a good idea. And the Jewish people were picked on forever and ever in history. Anyhow, I overate to fill the hole in my heart. And what I lost really is, every child is entitled to the unconditional love of parents. And that's what I didn't have. These people told me that they loved me. But how do I know if I don't do exactly what they tell me to do? Will they throw me out on the street? What's going to happen to me? And I overate and I got heavier and heavier. And they told me that if I get too heavy, nobody's going to love me. And that's the worst thing they could have said because my self-image was down to the ground. I had lots of girlfriends in high school, but I had no boyfriends. I was scared to even look at a boy, let alone smile at a boy. I always went to all girls schools in Europe, and my girlfriends were dating and I wasn't, and my cousins were getting ready to go to college. I wanted to go to college too. But that wasn't my uncle's thought, and he thought I should be a secretary, and that's the last thing I wanted to do. But nobody bothered to ask me what I wanted to do. Anyhow, I decided if my mother wanted me to be a doctor and I couldn't be a doctor, then I'm going to become a nurse. So I applied. And I was not only accepted at Mount Sinai Hospital, I even got a scholarship to the nursing school. And that spring of my senior year, one of my girlfriends said, "You want to go on a blind date?" And I said, "Sure." And that's where I met Danny. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, there was a boy in the world who liked me. And Danny liked me very much. And he liked me so much that he kept calling and he kept coming over. And he became a nightly visitor at our house. And within 6 weeks, he offered to marry me. I wasn't quite 18 years old yet. I went to school the next day and I told my best friend that Danny asked me to marry him. And she said, "Oh, what did you say?" And I said, "Well, I guess I said, okay." Well, news spread through Sen High School that Agnes is getting married. My friends were going to college, but I was getting married. And finally, I became the belle of the ball someplace. And I enjoyed my popularity. And if there are any teenagers listening to me, please make sure that you finish your education, because you never know what life will bring your way when you have to support yourself and your and possibly some children. So don't let anything stand in the way of your education. Anyhow, the October of 1951, Danny and I got married, and I was happy for the first time since I've come to the United States. I had somebody who loved me because of myself and not because they owed me anything, because they were a member of the family. The marriage brought us 3 children. Oh, by the way, we moved to Houston soon after we were married. And, I was always taught that America was the land of the free and what a wonderful country it was. And here I found, this was before the Civil Rights Movement. So Blacks had separate bathrooms and separate water fountains. And it absolutely shocked me because this is not what I imagined for America to be. Our first child was born in Houston. And after that, we moved back to Chicago. And I had 2 more children. And my husband never made a good living, but we managed. I enjoyed being a stay-at-home mommy. I could not have imagined going to work and leaving my children with somebody else, unlike today's world. And we went along very nicely for 13 years, and then my husband started telling some very strange stories. The first story I can remember that really stuck out was he was an electronic technician, and he was teaching a night class at an electronics school. And he told me not to say anything on the telephone to him because the phones were bugged, and that sounded very strange to me. Anyhow, the stories became more and more paranoid until one night he called me and told me that he was going to commit suicide. And then I knew I had to get some help. And with the help of his uncle and aunt who babysat, and his uncle drove us to the hospital. I got him to Maple East Hospital. And where very shortly after talking to him, he was admitted to the psychiatric ward. And they wouldn't tell me, they wouldn't give me a diagnosis, and I read any book and every book I could on mental illness. And I said to the doctor, he's a paranoid schizophrenic, and he looked at me and he said, well, we don't put names on illnesses, we treat symptoms. So he was probably there for a good 6 weeks. And my children were standing in the big picture window in our living room in anticipation of Daddy coming home. And I was also told that his illness could be acute and it could go away just as it came, or it could become chronic, and then it's going to stay with him. Well, I was hoping that it would go away and we could resume our lives, but it did not. And as soon as he came home, he stopped taking his medication. And the psychiatrist who was treating him told me that I'm going to need supportive therapy and I should turn to the Jewish Federation, which I did. And this was the first time that my story started to unfold, because for 50 years after the Holocaust, nobody wanted to hear about it. So little by little, I was beginning to learn why I went down certain paths in my life and why I married Danny. And his condition did become chronic, and Michael Reese would no longer take him because they only treated acute cases. At that time, there was a state mental hospital in Kankakee, and I had to go to court several times to have him committed. And finally, in a couple of years, I arrived to the point where I knew that I couldn't help him, and I had to do something to stabilize my children's lives and mine. And finally, I arrived at the decision of getting a divorce. It was a very, very hard decision, because would he have had any other illness, I would have definitely stuck by him. But this ruled our lives, and I had to bring some stability into the home. So after 15 years of marriage, I finally got a divorce. Now, in the meantime, the Jewish Federation had me tested and wanted to send me to college. And I thought, oh my God, now somebody wants to send me to college. Well, I don't have 4 years. I have to feed and put a roof over the heads of 3 kids. Anyhow, I went to business college for a year. And I became a very good stenographer. And I got my first job with Wilson and Company, the meat packers. They had an office in the Prudential building. And I was with them for 3 years. And then I started to ask questions about where I could make a better living. And I learned that law offices had the best pay scale. And that's how I got my first job with Brody and Gore, an insurance law defense firm. And oh, I learned so much there. It opened a whole new window in my life. An entirely new vocabulary, terms that I never heard of. What's a deposition? What's an interrogatory? What is a court hearing? Anyhow, I was with Brody and Gore for several years until both senior partners died. And sometimes luck goes your way, and the office manager retired and I was promoted and I made a better living. And Mr. Brody needed somebody to dictate to Saturdays, and I could come in for a half a day Saturday. I would take my little daughter with me, and I'd work a half a day, and this is the way we made it until everybody was grown up. I dated some during those years, but I promised myself that I would never bring a man into the home while the children were still home. They had gone through enough. And 2 out of the 3 kids graduated from college, both from the University of Illinois, one in Chicago, the other one in Champaign. My 3rd child, my middle child, was a real problem. He dropped out of school. He missed his father. He was very close to his father. He couldn't understand what happened. And a very fine therapist, a very smart lady, one time said to me, Billy will go back to school when he feels a need for it and not a day before. And that's exactly what happened. When he felt that he needed the high school diploma, he went back and he got his GED. And he was very clever with his hands. He inherited that from his dad. And he was able to fix anything and everything. And eventually he went to work for as a maintenance man for one of the big hotels. And today he is maintenance supervisor at the Sheraton Hotel in Colorado. And he's close to retirement age. My oldest son ended up in the printing business, and he recently retired. And my daughter went on and had 3 children. And it's interesting because my mother-in-law had 2 boys and a girl. I had 2 boys and a girl, and so did my daughter. And so the 3rd generation, my grandchildren, I'm so proud of them. They each have graduate degrees. They're all doing very well. And the 3 3 grandchildren gave me, well, I'm used to saying 4 great grandchildren, but in August, my granddaughter gave me the 5th one. And so I am very, very happy to see that their lives are all going well. And I am very, very proud of them. And I would really like to finish my talk to you with telling you to please take care of democracy, because next to food and water, that's the most important thing in your life. Without democracy, you don't want to find out what it is to live under a dictator. And I don't love telling my story. I tell you my story, so it will not just go down in a history book just as another page. So please remember there was a Holocaust, and don't let anybody ever deny it, because tonight, even though it's through Zoom, you met a Holocaust survivor. and my generation is really dying out. And it's very, very important that the Holocaust is remembered and there is no persecution of any race or religion because we are all one God's children. God bless you all, and I wish you a good evening, and I would welcome any questions. And I can maybe tell you just a little bit more about how things went
Thank you
as I
so
talk some
much.
more.
Thank
You're
you so
welcome.
much, Agnes. Oh, wonderful. Again, you can drop your questions for Agnes in the Q&A box if you're online. Some of you here in person have submitted questions. So we've got a handful already, and so I'll begin asking those, Agnes. The first one has to do with your life, your early childhood before the Germans came. Just wondering if you could share more about what life was like before the Germans invaded, and maybe a story about your family being together.
Well, my life was very good. I spent most of summers with my grandparents out in the country, which I loved. I remember going to one particular park lots of times where I met with other kids, and we played hopscotch and jumped rope and did many of the same things American kids do. Sundays, often my father had two elderly aunts who perished during the Holocaust. But many times he took me to visit with them for a short while. And many Sundays we went to Buda, which was a hilly place. And there was a strange train that took you up the mountainside. And we took a big picnic lunch that Julia had fixed us Saturday. And my parents' friends joined us. And they had children too, so I had kids to play with. Nobody ever talked in front of me about a war. So as I said before, I was never really aware. You know, I'll tell you a quick funny story. We were taught in school, grammar school yet, that there's some soldiers fighting and we should knit socks and warm things for them. And well, my girlfriend and I decided that we're going to do that. Now, we had no idea that they were not our friends, they may be our enemies. Anyhow, we didn't have enough money to buy the yarn and the needles. And I went at night and I went into my father's wallet and helped myself. And well, of course, I got caught. And my father said, "Don't you think that I count my money and I know how much money?" I mean, he may have seen me do it. Anyhow, it was the eve of Yom Kippur, and that's one of the Jewish high holidays. And that's the Day of Atonement. And I thought, oh my God, what's my daddy going to do to me? Although he never laid a hand on me. But anyhow, he told me that he forgives me because that was the time to forgive all our enemies and all our sins. And so I got off the hook with that. But it was a lesson that I learned for the rest of my life, that you don't take something that doesn't belong to you.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. We've received several questions regarding Julia. And I think the best way to ask it would be, did you ever have any contact with her once you immigrated? Were you ever able to?
Julia and I corresponded now and then. And then my father wrote me, I think, and this is strictly from a child's perspective, I think she was older than my parents were. Mm-hmm. And she passed away. And after she passed away, the state of Israel was born, and Yad Vashem, the museum there, was built. And I wanted to get her into the Avenue of Righteous Christians. And it took me 2 years of correspondence with Julia Now, one of the reasons Julia was willing to hide me is because she had no family. Because a child asked me one time at the museum when I spoke, that would the shoe be on the other foot, would you have hidden a Jewish child? And I said to him, I would love to say very quickly, of course I would have, but if I had children, if I had parents, if I had relatives, and everybody's life was threatened, would I have? I don't know. So that's why I felt it was necessary to tell you that as far as I knew, Julia had no family. Anyhow, after 2 years of correspondence, Yad Vashem finally accepted her. And I was in Israel about 13 years ago, and I was at Yad Vashem, and my emotions spilled over there because I felt like I was at her grave. And I finally could truly thank her for risking her life to save mine. By the way, Yad Vashem took my testimony also. So it is there also. Besides that, I have written my memoir at the request of my grandchildren, and you can get it either from me or from Amazon. It's called The Roll of the Dice, and Mr. Jones has one, so
Yeah,
you
we'll
can
give
ask him
away
about it.
a couple copies of those tonight. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other questions in you sharing about your experience at Yad Vashem and feeling like you were able to thank Julia, the question was, what would you say to Julia today if you could talk to her?
Oh my God. I would not only thank her for myself, but you know, I've seen 4 generations before me now. And if she wouldn't have kept me alive, none of them would be here today. And just recently, I made a little video for my newest baby. And it says exactly that she probably will never have a chance to meet me when she's old enough to know who I am. And I explained that to her, that her grandma Cheryl was my baby, and her mommy Ashley is grandma Cheryl's baby, and that I was born at a terrible time, and that I love her and I wish her a better life.
Thank you for sharing that.
And by the way, Ashley named her after Julia. Her name is Clara Julia, which I really appreciated.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Have you ever been back to Budapest or visited?
Never. I have no desire to go back to Hungary at all. To me, well, as my uncle put it, where they murdered our family, and that's the. I have nobody left there. My father put up a beautiful tombstone for my mother and her whole family. Beautiful marble. I have a photograph of it. My cousin went to Budapest, and he went to the cemetery where it was put up, and the caretaker showed them the plot, and the grave has been desecrated. So Hungary is still one of the most anti-Semitic countries in the world, and I have absolutely no desire to go back there.
Thank you for sharing that. One question came in was if you could say a little bit about your first language, what it was, and do you still speak it?
Do I still speak it? Is that what? Yes,
Yeah.
I still speak it. As a matter of fact, as I got older, I need more help. And I have a Hungarian helper who doesn't really speak English. So my Hungarian, well, you know, at home when I was growing up, nobody talked Hungarian because the children didn't understand it. And of course, they wanted me to learn English. And then after I grew up, occasionally I talked Hungarian with my uncle and aunt. But they preferred English also. And I am much more comfortable today speaking English than Hungarian. Hungarian, I translate from English often. But I still get some nightmares. I still imagine the Nazis coming. But now when I dream about it, I'm trying to hide my children from them. So it never goes away. It may go to the back of your mind, but it never disappears. There are days when I can totally forgive my father for having left me. And there are days when I can't. And he went back and he remarried, which at the time I resented, but of course, as an adult, I look at it and he was still in his 40s. So he married a woman who lost her husband, and she happened to have had a little girl my age, a little girl and a little boy. And I was imagining my daddy now hugging another little girl. And that was not a very good feeling for me. My dad died quite young of a brain tumor. And I haven't had much to do with, I hate to call her my stepmother because I really didn't know her. So.
You mentioned that when you and your father returned back to your home, were able to come back to Budapest, and that no one really spoke about what had just happened. And that even when you came to America, your family didn't really talk about it. And you even said for 50 years, no one was interested. So when do you remember first being asked to share your story? What was that like, and why do you mentioned a little bit, but why do you keep telling your story over and over?
Okay, that's a good question. I have 3 grandchildren who grew up in Florida. And when the oldest one was in 8th grade, I happened to have been visiting. And all of a sudden he said to me, "Grandma, we're studying the Holocaust. Would you come to my school and speak?" And I said, "Oh, Jonathan, I don't know if I can do that. Let me sleep on it and I'll think about it." And I spent a very sleepless night. And I wrote some notes and I finally did it the next day. And let me tell you, it did not go as smoothly as it goes now, since I've told it so many times. Those children were absolutely in awe. They all gathered around me and asked me a zillion questions. And then I spoke at his brother's class, 8th grade, and then at his sister's. And then I lived on the south side of Chicago for many years. And I moved to Skokie, and I didn't realize that Skokie was a survivor community. And there were lots and lots of survivors. And that was my first exposure, really, to survivors. And I was in a store, and I happened to mention to somebody that I was born in Hungary, and he said, "Wait a minute, my sister works next door." Anyhow, called her sister over. Her name happened to have been Agnes also. And she told me about a group that met once a month, different homes, a group of Hungarian survivors. And she said, "Give me your phone number and I'll call you next time we have a meeting." And the first meeting she invited me, I turned down, and I said, "Oh no, I don't want to have anything to do with it." And the second meeting, I accepted. It was the best thing I ever did for myself. I found a very dear friend who she and I remained friends for years. She unfortunately passed away a year ago. And anyhow, most of that group is gone. And this Agnes died just recently. And I think there's one more person alive from that group. There were like 10 of us at one time. So, yeah.
Thank you. We have several other questions and just time for one more. And so I'm going to ask this one. What gives you hope for the world, Agnes?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. I suppose since I survived, and my God, this world is not in good shape right now. There's so much anti-Semitism all over the world, all over again, including the United States. Well, the children are the hope of the world, that they'll never allow anything like this to happen again. And let me urge your audience to come and visit our museum. I am going to speak at the museum for the first time since this virus madness. This coming Thursday, actually, I'm going to speak to a group of 8th graders there. So I am looking forward to it, and I hope that the world will open up a little more and more each day. And that we have all learned something from the past. You know, I don't think with today's communication, anything like could happen again. There could be similarities, but the hidden gas chambers couldn't be, because somebody would take a telephone and make a very quick picture and it will be all over the world in no time. So I can't compare it with that time of lack of information, because the only way the Germans got away with that was that they were hiding it. And people didn't want to know, to be honest, including President Roosevelt. He was my father's idol, and he fell off his pedestal to me when I learned that he turned the boat full of Jews back to their deaths, St. Louis. And I didn't find that out until I was in high school here.
Well, thank you so much. I know that your story has had a big impact tonight and will continue to do so. So thank you for.
If anybody has any questions, please feel free to give them my email address.
Okay, thank you.
Just make sure that you put something in the subject line, the Holocaust or something. Otherwise, I won't open it if I don't recognize it.
Yes, excellent. Well, I'm going to give out a couple copies of your book now, Agnes, to those who have come, and a couple tickets to the Holocaust
Wonderful.
Museum.
Thank you, and thank you for supporting the museum.
Yes, absolutely. It is a remarkable, remarkable place.
Yeah.
So
Have you been there? Have you seen it?
I have indeed. It's an unforgettable experience. So for our online viewers, the winner of this book is Catherine B. Catherine B. You can reach out to me here at the library. I'm going to pick that up. But we'll have a copy with your name on here, so feel free to come by.
We're just finishing up.
You can pick up a copy of Agnes's book, so congratulations, Catherine B. And here in person, our winner is Nancy Schroeder, and so you can come to the front desk before you leave and pick up that copy of the book. Congratulations, Nancy. And now I'm going to draw from all of the names, both online and in person, for 2 tickets to the Illinois Holocaust Museum. If you're selected, you'll want to stop by the library, give a call, or shoot me an email, and we'll arrange a time for you to come in and we'll purchase those tickets for you for the day that you would like to go. And the winner of that is, away from me, Carol Evans. Congratulations, Carol. You can stop by and we'll chat and get you those tickets to the museum. And again, hopefully many more of you will take a trip up to Skokie and visit the museum there in person as well. Once again, I want to thank the museum for arranging this event. And Agnes, thank you for this honor to spend the evening with you, to hear your story, to be able to ask these questions. And thank you for sharing your life with us tonight.
Thank you for inviting me to your library.
Yes.
And to your audience.
Absolutely.
Have a good night.
Yes, take care. Good night, everyone. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.